folks, welcome to this little video. This is a video for anyone who has chronic pain, chronic illness or chronic fatigue, and it's all about something called the PACE study. It's a really important thing for us to know about and to think about and to have in mind when we're going for treatment. The purpose of this study was to try to look at some proposed treatments for myalgic encephalomyelitis, ME, also known as chronic fatigue syndrome. And what they were trying to do was to look at a number of therapies and compare which ones might be effective in terms of giving the patients an improvement in their symptoms. ME is a debilitating illness, the causes of which are still not known by doctors, and it can be really debilitating. You know, at the severe end of the scale, people can be so unwell that they can't stand up and they have to crawl around their houses, or they can be so unwell that they can't eat and they have to be fed through a tube. So this study, called PACE, was really quite a large clinical trial. They managed to get over 600 patients involved in it. And the thing about that, having that many people involved, is that it makes the results apparently more solid. That's always the thing with clinical trials, like the bigger the better, right? So the more patients you have involved, or the more research subjects you have involved, then it gives the trial more credibility. It's quite an old study now, really. The results were published back in 2011. But after the results were published, that was not the end of the story. So the purpose of the trial was to compare different forms of treatment with the idea was that they would try and figure out which forms of treatment, if any, gave improvement and which didn't. And that's the key word, is improvement. So when they published the results of the study, they said that certain forms of treatment resulted in improvement, and I'll come back to that. The forms of treatment that they compared were adaptive pacing. So pacing, you may already be familiar with it. It's where you try to split activities into smaller, more manageable chunks. And the idea is that you look after the amount of energy that you have. Coming, I suppose, from the phrase to pace yourself. But it might mean, for example, if you're doing a household chore, it might mean that instead of like a healthy person who can just, cook something in one go, you break up the whole task into different chunks. So you might like slice something in the morning, fry part of the dish in the afternoon, or maybe then you put it all together in the evening, but you space out the activities. You who know about the spoon theory of energy, it's a way of kind of planning your day out as best you can according to how many spoons of energy you think you might have on that particular day. And you can also apply pacing to mental activities, and I'm going to do a separate video on that. When that video is done, I'll have a link appear up here, and YouTube magic will make the link appear up there, and you can check that one out. Let me know what you think. As well as pacing, they also compared graded exercise therapy, which is where patients were given an exercise regime that they gradually increased over time, and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a form of psychological therapy where you try to notice your thoughts and then challenge your negative thoughts. Yeah, so when the results were published, they seemed, the study seemed to have been a great success. And it seemed that they had discovered that pacing was not giving people improvement, but that graded exercise therapy and CBT were. But what the patients were saying was, well, we didn't find it helpful. We actually found it really harmful. Particularly, some of them said that the exercise therapy made them feel a good deal worse. And some of them subsequently said that they felt slightly under pressure to change their answers about how it was going. Yikes. So this is where the story gets really complicated. patient groups got together and asked for the background data for the study to be released. People running the study, which was being run under the auspices of a London university, refused to release it, and there followed a great deal of Freedom of Information Act requests. Some of those cases ended up before the Information Commissioner, and one of them ended up all the way at an appeals tribunal. In the main, what the tribunal said was, the argument put forward was that people might be identified, so that participants in the test hadn't signed up to be identified just willy-nilly for their data to be released. And so they were worried about that. That was why they said they didn't want to release the information. Also, in another complaint, they said that actually the patient groups had harassed them. The tribunal found in the main that they thought there was either a low risk of people who participated in the study being identified, or the tribunal said, well, the public interest in that information being released outweighs the risk of people being identified. So the tribunal agreed that the data should be released. Now, what happened after that was statisticians and people with presumably ginormous brains went over all the data and said that it didn't add up. And it turned out that the people running the PACE study had changed the parameters of the study partway through. Now, when the people who re-examined the data corrected for that change, the results were far less successful than they originally appeared to be. The numbers went way down. And I'm going to put links down in the description for you where you can check all of this stuff out for yourself. So a lot of people found this really alarming because the newspapers had taken it up. Some newspapers had published quite misleading articles which basically suggested that exercise could cure ME. But also the national guidelines here in the UK for treatment of ME had been amended to include graded exercise therapy and CBT. So there had been a pretty wholesale acceptance of the results of the test, and now people had found out that actually the numbers were not solid. So briefly, I'm just going to outline the rest of what has happened since then. In about 2015, I think it was, some academic researchers and medical doctors, about 5 or 6 of them, got together and wrote an open letter to the medical journal who had published the original article about the study. And they outlined their concerns, particularly about the numbers and the statistical analysis that had been done. They also raised concerns about some conflicts of interest. So the letter basically said, we're really concerned. We think that the medical journal should commission a wholly independent study and somebody should look at these numbers all again. Then years later, there was discussion of the study in the UK Parliament. All of the controversy between the two sides continued. The people who ran the original study still maintain that the treatment is good. They still maintain that their statistical analysis was justified. And as far as I'm aware, they haven't changed their stance on graded exercise therapy or CBT. What has happened relatively recently is that the national guidelines have been revised here in the UK, and the body that was responsible for making that decision, basically they decided to take graded exercise therapy and CBT out of the recommendations. That's done here in the UK by a body called NICE, N-I-C-E. Yeah, they set up a body with an acronym, NICE. It's pretty cute. I did read though that there had been some criticism of that by other doctors. So you can see that the issue is still bubbling along in some circles. And I think that the concerns of the patient charities and organizations is that the idea of graded exercise therapy and CBT have really kind of taken root as a treatment. They don't say that exercise shouldn't be done. What they say is that it shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all approach. And in relation to CBT, they say, well, probably, yeah, it could be a coping mechanism. But the key word is improvement, and it being put forward by the people who organised the study as effectively, a cure or a partial cure. And that's clearly not the case. I got a really good description of it that I heard on a podcast, which was somebody who said that asking someone with ME to do repeated physical exercise is like asking someone with asthma to breathe in dust. And what many of the doctors who have been involved in ME over the decades say is that unfortunately this characterization of ME as partly or mainly psychological, like there's an emotional or a mental component, means that there was absolutely no interest in doing research into the physical causes. So one of the doctors talks about how, years ago he was trying to do research into changes that he could see on the cellular level. Like he was investigating what was going on in cell metabolism and how that could be linked to some of the main ME symptoms. He basically says, because this psychological model, kind of behavioral model, lifestyle model, had all the interest and was really kind of gaining ground, he said nobody cared about the possible physical causes. There is a risk, isn't there? I think it's a little bit close to the slightly, Victorian idea when women complained of being in pain, doctors would diagnose them with hysteria as an actual thing. And there were some pretty gnarly ideas around about that. It was diagnosed as an emotional state, really, or a mental state, whereas it was just women saying, I'm sick, I'm in pain, can you help me? I think the context of this is important as well, because the ME charities are coming from a background where people used to refer to chronic fatigue syndrome as yuppie flu. So it's kind of a pejorative, dismissive term, isn't it? The idea that it's not really a real thing. So that's the maybe popular myth that they're trying to dispel. So in that respect, you can see how the PACE study findings can be actually really damaging. So how is it relevant to you, even if you don't have a formal diagnosis of ME? Well, I think the idea of GET and CBT being effective has kind of wormed its way into the medical profession a little bit. For example, I worked with a physiotherapist for just about a year, and their idea was that I should do something that looked really like GET. And I had a long list of exercises that I was to do or attempt to do every day. I would tick off a list every day, do a little tick and record the number of reps that I did. This is coming from an exercise nut, by the way. Before I started getting chronic pain, I was a complete exercise nut. I loved it. I was obsessed with dance. I used to go as often as I could. It was really intense. And the main thing that was so great about it was that I slept so much better. And so I just loved it. I loved it as an activity, and also it just meant that you slept really well afterwards. It was great. So I didn't take any persuading, when this particular physio was treating me to try this exercise therapy. And we did it religiously, followed the table religiously every day. One of the ideas that they had, though, was that regardless of how much of a flare-up or discomfort or pain I was in, I should attempt to do, at least 1 rep a day. What they said was 1 rep was better than nothing. And so I did that. Like I say, it went on for the best part of a year. What did I learn? Well, it didn't work. It didn't increase stamina much. It didn't do anything for the pain levels, mainly made them worse. Wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, because the whole time that you're involved in that, you're basically feeling like you're failing. There's like a thing like, oh, this should be working. Why isn't it working? Oh, it must be me, and your confidence takes a hideous battering, and that's all under the supervision of a medical professional. I gotta say, my experience of trying to do that, of doing at least one rep, no matter how ill you feel, it's not good. Not good. Because I'm an exercise nut, I still do little bits of exercise, but I wouldn't really refer to them as exercise anymore. I would just call it sort of gentle movement, and mainly it's kind of little bits of gentle yoga, lying flat on the floor, or some really gentle stretches, also lying flat on the floor. For example, there are videos by yoga instructors who have long COVID, who've had to completely modify the way they teach, and they're kind of the ones, if you want to try it, they're kind of the ones that I would recommend going for. I'm going to do another video all about movement, and you should check it out and let me know what you think. But even there's a video I found by a doctor in Japan, and he did a small study on some of his patients where he talked to some yoga teachers and got like gentle isometric movements from them, and he put them into a video. And at the start of the video, he says that he only wants people to use 10% of their available effort when they're doing the movements. Like, think about that, 10%. That's a really, really small number. So it just gives you an indication that actually there are doctors who think that caution is best when attempting this kind of thing. 10% is really low. So yeah, the reason I'd like really anyone who has chronic illness, chronic fatigue, or chronic pain to watch this is, I think it's really important to be aware of the PACE study when you're looking for new treatments. When I was being treated by that physiotherapist, I did not know about it. And if I had, I could have started a conversation about it, said, do you know about it? What do you think about it? Why are you recommending this for me? So I think you can ask health professionals questions about the PACE study. If the answers that you get are not well thought out and persuasive, then go elsewhere. You might want to give something like GET a go if you've got a physiotherapist that you trust. But now that you have the information, might, if it's not working, you might stop sooner. Like, you're unlikely to keep going for as long as I did, right? And like lose a year of your life feeling absolutely miserable. Yeah. So now you've got the information, right? That's it for this little video, you guys. I hope that it's been useful for you and helpful for you. I think the more of us that know about the PACE study, the better. If you like this video, please go ahead and subscribe, or you can also click the little bell button. You're like, oh, why do you sound surprised about the bell button? We knew about the bell button for years. No, I didn't know. There's a bell button that you have to click if you want YouTube to tell you about people's new videos. I just literally learned that. It's tragic really when you think about it. But anyway, there's that button if you like. Or also, can you let me know in the comments if you've had experiences with this kind of thing? Like maybe you've experienced GET or CBT, and let me know what you think. Somewhere on this screen, when they're done, when I've done videos on topics that are linked to this, like say I'm going to do a video on different forms of psychological therapies for chronic pain and chronic illness, and like I'm going to do a video on movement. I'm going to put the links on the screen so you can click on them and check them out. I hope I see you on the next one, and in the meantime, if you can, take it easy, and whatever you do, go gently on yourself.